are putting forward a private members motion in the Dáil tomorrow to propose a series of measures to address what is now an absolutely dire housing crisis, which is now overlaid with an accommodation crisis for people fleeing war and conflict in Ukraine and elsewhere in the world. And I think we would say you can't really separate the government's failure to deal with the housing and homelessness crisis from their failure to have adequate accommodation for people fleeing war and conflict in Ukraine and elsewhere. So we are trying to propose some practical measures, which indeed we've been advocating to the government for months now in the private members' motion tomorrow. One thing that first of all we want to highlight is that despite the government's introduction, belatedly, of an eviction ban, there is a major hole in that legislation, which means that people who got termination dates for their notice to quit prior to the introduction of the emergency period, which begins on the 1st of November, those people can still be evicted. That hole needs to be closed off, and the government need to clarify, is that a mistake or have they deliberately done that? But in any event, it needs to be addressed, because it makes absolutely no sense to allow anybody to be evicted into homelessness when we have nearly 11,000 families already homeless, and where we have an absolutely dire accommodation and homelessness crisis. But the centrepiece of our motion tomorrow, as well as highlighting that, is to say we need radical action to deal with the issue of vacant and empty and derelict property and unused sites. And we are proposing to the government that there should be a use it or lose it provision where any empty, vacant or derelict property or unactivated planning permission that is not brought into use within 6 months, where there is no good or legitimate reason for that, that the state must acquire that property or that site for use as social and affordable housing. It is simply unconscionable that we have 160,000 empty properties, we have maybe more than 20,000 derelict properties, and at the same time we have tens and tens of thousands of people who are unable to get social housing, more than 10,000 in emergency accommodation, and of course thousands of desperate people fleeing war and conflict unable to get accommodation. The solution is staring us in the face, but the government won't take the necessary action to get hold of the vacant and empty property and sites that are being hoarded by property developers and property speculators, which could be used and activated to provide social and affordable accommodation for the many tens of thousands who need it as a matter of urgency. We're also saying that the government must take a much higher proportion of new developments for social and affordable housing. Currently, on most new developments, the state is only getting 10% of social housing. On some newer developments, maybe 20%. That is absolutely pathetically inadequate when you look at the scale of the housing and accommodation crisis that we're facing. So we are saying they must go way beyond the 10 or 20% and grab a much larger proportion. I mean, to give an example, in Finland, for example, any new construction that happens, 55% of any new development goes for social and affordable housing. That's the sort of target we should be aiming at, because it simply doesn't make any sense that new housing that may come on stream is unaffordable to those who actually need it most. So finally, we're also proposing there will be a state construction company, because it is absolutely clear that the private sector cannot be relied upon to activate the sites that need to be activated for housing or to refurbish the vacant and derelict property. So we need the state to have its own capacity to do that. So we are saying we need to have a state construction company where the state begins to take on tradespeople as apprentices to equip and staff local authorities to be be able to directly themselves bring empty and vacant property back into use, to activate sites that are just sitting vacant when they could be used to develop social and affordable housing. So it's going to be interesting to see whether the government will act on these things, and really what it comes down to is the government willing to abandon its continued reliance on private developers in the private sector, which has clearly failed to solve the housing and homelessness crisis, or are the state willing to take measures to directly intervene and solve this crisis themselves? And that's what the motion is proposing, and we hope that the opposition obviously will support us in this, but that the government will actually listen, because it's clear their policies are failing at every level to deal with the housing and accommodation crisis.
Yeah, it's quite clear that the Irish government has very cynically used Putin's imperialist, brutal invasion of Ukraine to drive a horse and cart through what remains of Irish neutrality. I got PQ answers back recently which confirmed that the Irish government has now been represented at 5 meetings of the so-called Ukraine Contact Defence Group. This is something that's been described by the US Secretary of Defence as a NATO alliance. Its meetings take place when they're not online. Its meetings take place at NATO headquarters at the Ramstein US airbase in Germany. It's very clearly an extension of the NATO alliance. Last week, Minister Coveney confirmed that the Irish military will be participating in a training exercise for the Ukrainian military that comes on top of the delivery of armaments. The Irish government says, well, we contributed to the non-lethal parts of the weaponry going to Ukraine. I mean, even according to the Constitution, the Irish state should not participate in any military conflict without the assent of Dáil Éireann. The government has not brought the military training to Dáil Éireann. The government have not brought the military equipment in front of Dáil Éireann. The government has not brought its participation in the NATO alliance of the Ukraine Contact Defence Group to Dáil Éireann, and they're ignoring obviously the opinion of the vast majority of the public who are in favour of defending the idea of neutrality, of maintaining a consistent anti-imperialist position against the imperialism of Putin, which, you know, obviously the vast majority of people are opposed to his invasion of Ukraine, but also the expansionism and imperialism of the US and NATO. So we're going to be raising this very strongly in the Dáil this week. We'll also be making the point that if the Irish government actually wants to give real and meaningful solidarity to the Ukrainian people, one, obviously, we should be ensuring that there are no Ukrainian refugee, like no Syrian refugee, no Russian refugee, no Irish person should be sleeping on the streets. The Irish government should be shutting down the shadow banking system, which continues to be used by Russian oligarchs as well as oligarchs from other countries, and the Irish government should be pushing for debt cancellation for Ukraine. We'll also be saying that they should be saying that the EU should open its borders to Russian refugees. It makes no sense at all to say to those who are trying to flee conscription in Russia, no, you have to stay in Russia where you can be conscripted into this army in a very authoritarian and dictatorial state. It's interesting, if you look at the numbers of refugees coming to Ireland, there's been a significant increase in the number of refugees applying through the IPAS system from Georgia, and many of those will be dual citizens who are liable to be conscripted within Russia and therefore are attempting to flee here. But there'll be many, many more Russians who don't have another passport who would want to get out that the EU and Ireland should facilitate. Just one other brief point. I mean, the last while I've been speaking a lot about the fact that it's scandalous that under the TBES scheme, data centres will be able to benefit to the tune of €10,000 a month, with the public subsidising the electricity usage of some of the biggest, richest corporations in the world. Now that we have the finance bill, we can see it's even worse than that. Instead of data centres being able to get €10,000 a month, they will actually be able to get €30,000 a month, because they'll be able to claim for each separate location where they have a data centre, each separate MPRN, they'll be able to get €10,000 up to a maximum of €30,000 a month, and in total they'll be able to make up to €500,000. If they extend the scheme, that's what's outlined in the bill. These major multinational corporations could get €500,000 paid for by the public. It's an absolute scandal that would be incentivising their continued guzzling of a very large proportion, 17% of our electricity generation.
So yeah, I just want to make points on two issues, and they are abortion and an update really on the pay-as-you-go meter situation. So in terms of abortion, we will be voicing support for this Saturday's demonstration taking place here in Dublin, which is a commemoration of Savita 10 years after her cruel and unnecessary death, but also calling for greater abortion rights for women in this society today, 4 years after repeal. Particularly, I will be raising an issue about the review of the legislation, which the Taoiseach said last week would be published by the end of the year. In answering my questions on this issue last week, the Taoiseach said that there had been two pieces of research submitted, namely research from Trinity College on the experience of service users and the experience of providers of services. That second piece of research was done under the Manchester Metropolitan University. The Taoiseach said that the Trinity research has been published in July. But he didn't say whether the Manchester Metropolitan University research has been published. I understand that it hasn't, and I will be asking why it hasn't been published, and also when it is due to be published. So you might want to keep an eye out for a reply on that. In terms of the pay-as-you-go, the change that we've seen in the last week is it's been announced that pay-as-you-go gas customers will no longer have to pay the €199 fee if they want to transfer to bill pay. I think that is a sign of the fact that the government and the energy companies are under a degree of pressure on this issue. It's a welcome change. But there are many other penalties which still remain in place and which need to go as well. Also, the change that was announced, it can't be a solution this winter for big numbers of people, because there's time and effort involved in making that switch. So if a large number of pay-as-you-go customers wanted to make the switch, probably wouldn't happen within the time frame of this winter. So we'll be keeping the pressure on. We'll be calling for a major extension of the emergency credits, and we'll be calling for a total ban on disconnections, not just for the bill pay customers as we have, but for the pay-as-you-go customers as well. Final point on that. We've been asking questions about the hardship funds that the companies have. We asked a parliamentary question. The Minister said that they have hardship funds, the various companies. The question that was asked was how much is in the hardship funds. I think it's interesting that question was not answered. The Minister is meeting with the companies. Has he not asked them? And if you go on the Prepaid Power website, you won't see any mention of a hardship fund. Does that company have a hardship fund? That's a question that's worth asking. And then finally, just a little bit wary of the Minister announcing the results of his discussions next week when the Dáil is not in session. He should answer the questions and put forward the proposals this week before the Dáil breaks for the mid-term break. Sinead.
Do you have any confidence that the Minister can deliver 4,000 places in local authority buildings which you said will be refurbished and will have dormitory style accommodation fairly soon?
I have absolutely no confidence. The government keeps making pronouncements, setting targets, and then it fails consistently to meet those targets or to keep those promises. And a lot of the problem is that the state simply does not have its own capacity to refurbish empty properties, to activate sites where there are planning permission for housing, but it is completely reliant on private developers. And it is self-evident that private building is slowing down. The problem with private builders is they only build when they can make a profit. The state has to have its own capacity to respond quickly, to activate sites and to refurbish vacant and empty properties. And I know in my area, I wrote last summer to the Minister about buildings, some of them publicly owned, some privately owned, that could be used for accommodation for people, and still nothing happens to these sites. So it's self-evident that the government is not matching its own rhetoric and its own promises. I'm sorry, if I might just mention, I forgot to mention the Tany House case that's happening at the moment, because there's, among others, there's a people before profit councillor living there, but there's 35 families now are being faced by a mass eviction by a landlord who's trying to circumvent the residential tenancies legislation around the Tyrrellstown Amendment to mass evict 35 families. The government need to step in immediately and purchase that property. Under no circumstances should the government entertain any possibility that 35 families and individuals should be potentially homelessness in the teeth of an absolutely enormous crisis. And the government pay lip service to some of these ideas, but again, in my own area, we've been fighting for the council to take over certain properties where there's empty properties and where there's tenants faced with eviction, and they still don't do it. They say they're going to do it, but they don't actually do it. So we need action, not words and promises from the government on reactivating and refurbishing empty and vacant property to address what is an absolutely catastrophic housing and accommodation crisis.
Just finally, when you say the state, is that the state would hire builders that be employed, a state employee?
Yeah, part of our motion is to say we need a state construction company, so it has its own capacity. One of the terrible consequences of the government's abandonment of social housing construction over the last couple of decades is they hollowed out the ability of local authorities to directly construct housing and to refurbish vacant and empty property. So they're completely reliant on outsourcing to private contractors and private developers. And of course, if they go bang, or if they can't source contractors or developers, nothing happens. One example in my own area is a development of 42 co-op social housing units in Loughlinstown, and the developer has just pulled out in recent months, and that whole project is now stalled because the local authority doesn't have its own capacity to just go out and build those houses. And that's true of vacant and empty property as well. So you get vacant and empty property sitting there for months and months and months while the local authority is trying to source private contractors rather than have its own capacity, construction capacity with tradespeople, with apprentices to go out and just do the work immediately and bring those houses back into use. And it drives communities absolutely crazy when they see empty property sitting around in estates near them and they have family members who are homeless or on housing lists for a decade, and nothing moves with those properties for months, sometimes years. It's absolutely outrageous. So we think the state has to have its own construction capacity.